Hello everyone. Today's episode will be atypical because I divided it into two parts. The story itself is very much atypical. I'm wondering how many people looking at the title of this episode knew straight away what case I'll be covering today. Because this case is widely known as the Tomasza Komendy case. But I couldn't name it like that, it wouldn't be fair. There are many victims in this case and I don't want to put them in any hierarchy, but rather in chronological order, and therefore, naming this episode, I focused on the place where the murder happened, Miłoszyce. It's New Year's Eve of 1996. Małgorzata Kwiatkowska, a 15-year-old high school student, is at a disco with her friends. On the first day of 1997, it turns out that she's the only person who never came home from the party. And for the next few decades, nobody was to find out who actually killed the girl. My name is Alex, and this is Poland Unveiled. Małgorzata Kwiatkowska was born on the 5th of October 1981. She lived in Jelcz-Laskowice, a small town in Lower Silesia Voivodeship, along with her parents, Jadwiga and Krzysztof. A few years after she was born, her parents had another baby, another daughter, Ewelina. There were no other siblings in this family, which is quite an important piece of information in this case, as you'll find out later. The family of four lived in a block of flats among many similar families of a typical 90s lower middle class. Małgosia's mom, Jadwiga, was a homemaker, whereas Mr. Kwiatkowski worked for the biggest employer in town, Jelcz Car Factory. This factory is still well known and still operates up to this day, manufacturing buses and trucks. I tried my best to find as much information as I could about Małgosia, for she is, or should be, the center of this story. In 1996, she was 15, and she was a high school student. Małgosia was a petite girl, about 5 feet tall. She had long brown hair and fringe, and dark brown eyes. She was a girly girl. She loved getting dressed up, makeup, and jewelry. She had friends, and at least one best friend, Iwona, whom Małgosia had known since kindergarten. The girls didn't go to the same high school, but remained close. Małgosia's parents weren't too happy about them two hanging out together, especially after a situation that took place at the end of November 1996. It was the eve of St. Andrew's Day, which is the 29th of November, and that night used to be heavily celebrated in Poland. It's pretty much the last chance to party before Advent, which in Catholic Church is these few weeks before Christmas. St. Andrew's Eve is the night when people traditionally get together to party and play fortune-telling games, as weird as it may sound, but I know these celebrations are known in many other European countries. This fortune-telling was particularly designed for young girls, and most of the predictions relate to their future marriage, husband, and so on. It must have gotten exciting for two 15-year-old girls because that night, Małgosia got home from the party many hours after her curfew. Her parents thought that it was Iwona's fault because Małgosia, up to that point, used to be an extremely well-behaved girl. And to be honest, she still was. Besides this one cook-up, when Małgosia got home late from the party, she was nothing but a perfect eldest daughter for her parents, a good student. She would help at home, and there were never any complaints about her behavior from her teachers or neighbors. Also, Małgosia never complained about the fact that her parents weren't rich, and she would often get second-hand clothes from her cousins, instead of new ones. She would get some pocket money every month that she would spend on magazines for teenagers. She mostly bought them for little gifts added to these magazines, like pieces of jewelry. The girl's upbringing can be considered somewhat traditional or even strict these days. Małgosia's parents, worried about the girl, would rarely let her go out or even wear dresses or lipstick in public. They didn't want the 15-year-old girl to meet boys or party, which seems reasonable, and for the most part, Małgosia wouldn't rebel. Except for this one time. New Year's Eve celebrations of 1996 were coming, and Małgosia was still grounded since the end of November. She was hoping that her parents would let her go to a disco and welcome the new year of 1997 with her friends. But Jadwiga and Krzysztof, still remembering the fear and anger they felt when Małgosia came home from their last party at about 3 a.m, didn't even want to hear about it. Małgosia kept telling them that this was not a random place she wanted to go to, but a professional disco with security and so on, that she wanted to go with other girls her age, not boys, that she was 15, so not a kid anymore, and she would be fine. Małgosia and her parents would fight about this for days. The girl was getting more and more upset and just sad about the situation, and eventually, the day before the party, Małgosia's parents said yes. Of course, the girl was supposed to get back home at a certain hour, wear warm clothes. Her dad even suggested she wear pants instead of a dress, either for safety or because of the frost outside, but the girl wouldn't listen. She put on a middle-length black dress that she got from her cousin, black tights, and because it was really cold and her boots were a bit too big, she put on white socks with red and green stripes underneath the tights. So socks first, then tights on top. When it comes to accessories, it seems she didn't have a handbag. I'm guessing that everything she might have needed at the party she could have easily put in the pockets of her jacket, like lip gloss, some money, maybe tissues. Bear in mind it was 1996. Nobody had a cell phone back then, and definitely not a single 15-year-old girl would have a camera of her own at that time that she could bring to a party to take selfies. That's why I think Małgosia didn't really need a handbag. She also had some jewelry on, like 3 dainty necklaces, including one that I think was her favorite, with a heart and "I love you" written on it. She also wore 3 earrings, a ring, and a black watch. All this, however, was covered by a dark blue thick winter jacket, white hat, and black woolen gloves. It was super cold outside. At some point of that night, the temperature was about minus 20 degrees Celsius. The disco was located about 4 kilometers away from Jelcz, in Miłoszyce. The place was called Alcatraz. Małgosia and Iwona took a train to get there and met the rest of their friends by the disco shortly before 8 p.m. When the disco eventually started, the entire gang paid for the tickets, went by security, and left their jackets in a cloakroom, then found a free table and sat by it together. Małgosia and Iwona managed to order a beer each, even though they were both 15 at the time. Also, many people at the party brought their own alcohol, as it was much cheaper than drinks at the bar. This was the cheapest disco in the area, and therefore, many young people from Miłoszyce and the nearest towns and villages came to Alcatraz to party that night, including 17-year-old Krzysztof and his best friend. At about 10 p.m., Krzysztof was approached by a pretty girl who, much to his surprise, but also, let's say it, delight, told him her name and where she lived. It was Małgorzata Kwiatkowska. She was obviously hitting on him, and Krzysztof felt proud. They started dancing together, but at some point, Małgosia said she didn't feel well, and they went outside together to get some air. They would go outside many times that night. Krzysztof noted that Małgosia was even sick one time, but she insisted on getting back inside and dancing more. Closer to midnight, Krzysztof left her with her friends and popped out for a moment to get some sparkling wine from home. When he returned, Małgosia climbed on his lap, and it showed that it wasn't her usual behavior towards boys. Her girlfriends were shocked by her boldness. After midnight, but still before 1 a.m., Małgosia and Krzysztof went outside 1 or 2 times. They were remembered by other people, especially Małgosia, who seemed to be so drunk that she barely recognized familiar faces of her friends or even neighbors of her age who were also at that party. She didn't know what was going on around her. What's worth noting, however, is the fact that, according to her friends' later depositions, Małgosia didn't drink much that night. But at the same time, she was only 15 and she couldn't have had much experience with alcohol. She had only started to go out maybe a few months before New Year's Eve. But also, according to the witnesses, there were more girls like Małgosia that night who barely touched any alcohol and yet seemed to be heavily drunk and sick. It was before 1 a.m. when Małgosia and Krzysztof were approached by an unknown to Krzysztof guy. He was about 20 years old. This guy said to Małgosia, "Wow, you're freaking drunk." When Małgosia didn't respond, he said, "Don't you recognize your own brother?" "It's me, Irek." When Małgosia still didn't say anything, the guy who introduced himself as Irek, it's short for Ireneusz, told Krzysztof that he was taking Małgosia, his sister, home. Krzysztof wanted to help, but Irek asked if Krzysztof was Małgosia's boyfriend. Krzysztof denied, saying that he only met Małgosia a few hours ago at the party, to which Irek replied that, in this case, he, Irek, would help his own sister get back home, and Krzysztof should get back inside. Krzysztof couldn't have known that this New Year's Eve party was the first and the last time he would ever see Małgosia Kwiatkowska. That even though she gave him her address, he would never be able to surprise her by her flat and ask her out on a proper date. He couldn't have known that she didn't have a brother. And he couldn't have known that meeting this girl would forever change his life. The last time Krzysztof sees Małgosia, she walks with Irek in the middle of the night, supported on his arm. Then a moment later, another boy approaches Małgosia and Irek, and the three of them slowly walk down the main road of Miłoszyce and disappear. It's 4 a.m., the 1st of January 1997. Jadwiga and Krzysztof Kwiatkowski, Małgosia's parents, are back home from their New Year's Eve party. They're expecting their eldest daughter to be home at 5 a.m. Jadwiga will not go to bed until Małgosia is home. It's past 5 a.m., past the curfew set for this night, and the girl is still not home. The train that was supposed to bring Małgosia home has long arrived. At about 6 a.m., very nervous Jadwiga calls Iwona's landline. Iwona was Małgosia's best friend. Iwona's mom picks up and confirms that her daughter has been home since shortly 5 a.m. It turns out that Małgosia didn't get on the train with her friends. Iwona, woken up by her mother, is surprised by all these questions she's asked. She was absolutely sure that Małgosia got home much earlier because she felt sick at the party, and then at some point she disappeared. So Iwona and her friends assumed that Małgosia had gone home. Admittedly though, Małgosia's jacket was still in the cloakroom when Iwona and the rest of the gang were leaving the disco, so they took the jacket so that Iwona could give it back to Małgosia when they meet the next time. Mrs. Kwiatkowska knows there's no time to lose. She wakes her husband up, and together they go to Iwona's house. Iwona, her father, and Małgosia's parents drive to Miłoszyce to check if by any chance Małgosia is still at the disco. It's almost 7 a.m. The disco is over. Nobody is left in the building except for its owners. Małgosia's mom still goes inside and check if the owners are right. The building wasn't big, small entrance, cloakroom, then a dance floor with a bar and some tables on the side. Nothing special, nobody's there anymore. Jadwiga, Krzysztof, Iwona and her father start to check the nearest buildings. They knock on doors and wake up people who just went to sleep after a night of partying. But everyone seems to understand the situation and want to help as much as they can. They wake up their children and check their bedrooms. Maybe Małgosia, too tired or too drunk to get back home, is spending the night in one of the nearest houses. Maybe someone saw her and took care of her. But Małgosia is nowhere to be found. In one of the houses, Jadwiga, Małgosia's mother, meets her former colleague, Urszula. Urszula is also a mom to a teenager. Her son, Andrzej, also spent the night at the disco. She wakes her son up, and as it turns out, he didn't go to the disco alone. He went there with his best friend, Krzysztof. The same Krzysztof who accompanied Małgosia almost the entire night. Andrzej said that, of course, he remembered Małgosia, especially because she was so sick and drunk. He said that Krzysztof, his friend, would go outside with Małgosia many times, and one time the girl's brother, Irek, approached them and took Małgosia home. To which Urszula added that she indeed saw a girl that night about 1 a.m. with two boys who were helping her walk down the street. She remembered that because it was really, really cold, and the girl had no jacket, no hat, scarf, or gloves on. But Urszula probably figured that they lived somewhere nearby and that the girl would be fine. Małgosia's parents are shocked. They don't have a son. Małgosia doesn't have a brother. They asked around and found out that the DJ's name was Irek, but he turned out not to be the same Irek that took Małgosia. He was questioned later by the police, and he was seen by hundreds of people almost all night because he worked as a DJ, and in those moments when he could take a break, he was either sitting with his wife and brother or his boss, the owner of the entire place. After a few hours, Małgosia's parents went back home. They tried to involve the police in the search. They called the police station in Wrocław. Wrocław is the capital city of Lower Silesia, but they got dismissed. Then they tried with the local police in Jelcz, but nobody wanted to listen to them. They heard it was only a few hours into the new year. Everyone partied hard the last night, and the girl would sober up at some point and come back home, like probably hundreds of other teenagers in Poland today. But Jadwiga and Krzysztof knew their daughter. Even after the last party, she didn't come back home that late. They knew that something was off, and they begged for intervention. Eventually, the local police station agreed to send an officer over to Miłoszyce to look around. They asked Małgosia's parents to take from home a picture of the girl, and then everyone met by the disco building. The police officer took the same route as Małgosia's parents, Iwona and her father, a few hours earlier, and asked people in the neighborhood if anyone had seen the girl. To no avail. The officer tried to calm Małgosia's parents down, but that feeling that something bad happened didn't want to leave them. At about 1 p.m., missing person report filed by Małgosia's parents was officially accepted at the police station in Jelcz. At 2 p.m., the officer and the parents go back to Miłoszyce to continue their search. But something's changed. They see the police cars and an ambulance ride by a house located about 350 meters away from the disco building. It belonged to a family whose last name starts with R. This is how I will refer to them for the rest of the story. Małgosia's parents checked this house before. A woman who lived there with her family didn't know Małgosia, but she entered the bedrooms of her children to check if the girl hadn't been taken home by one of her daughters to spend the night there safely. Her girls and their boyfriend also went to the disco that night. But Małgosia wasn't there, or at least, not in the house. This entire place consisted of a few buildings with a yard in the middle, at the back of the house. There was a big barn and some outbuildings. And right by the barn, Małgosia's body was discovered by the father of the R family. When Małgosia's parents saw the crowd and the ambulance, they knew straight away that it had something to do with their daughter, but hoped that if the ambulance was called, the girl was alive and maybe the paramedics were trying to help her. They jumped out of the car screaming, "Is she alive? Is she okay?" When somebody eventually replied, "No, she's dead." The police didn't want to let Jadwiga and Krzysztof into the yard. The prosecutor was already there, working along with the investigators. I would say it's probably for the best that her parents couldn't see Małgosia, that nobody allowed them to see something that no parent should ever see or experience. Małgosia was found with no clothes on, besides her white socks with red and green stripes. And it was evident that she suffered before she passed away. First because, as I mentioned earlier, it was about minus 20 degrees Celsius the night before, and the girl was lying naked on the ground, covered with fresh snow. Second, her body was covered with wounds, bruises, and blood. Postmortem lividity was also already visible. Małgosia had been dead for many hours before her body was discovered by the barn. The examination of the crime scene took the rest of the day. The body was taken to the morgue, and a few days after, the autopsy was carried out. The doctor who examined the body could tell straight away that Małgosia was a victim of extremely brutal violence. I don't want to be explicit, but I also want to be fair here, so that you can try and imagine the monstrosity of what this 15-year-old high school student went through. She was raped so brutally that she bled out and froze to death afterwards. She was also bitten. There were jaw prints on her breasts and arms, and she was beaten up. She tried to fight with whoever did this to her. She had abrasions of the epidermis in many places on her body. Also, some epidermis, probably of the attacker, was found under her nails. It was speculated that Małgosia could still be alive for 2, maybe 3 hours after the attack. Left alone in the dark, when no one could see her or hear her, naked in the freezing cold, and slowly bleeding out. Standard tests were carried out and evidence was collected. It turned out that Małgosia had 0.9 per mile of alcohol in her blood, but 1.7 per mile was found in her urine. No sign of most popular drugs. The doctor collected smears from the girl's mouth, vagina, and anus, as well as smears from Małgosia's clothes, found on the scene, under and around her body. There were signs of hair, blood, and other substances, especially on her underwear. What's interesting, Małgosia's boots and jewelry were not found at the scene. The police eventually had to let at least one of Małgosia's parents see her body to officially identify it. It was her father who went to the morgue. Seeing her hair and her face was enough for him to recognize his daughter. I don't know if that's the case here, but I hope he never got to see the rest of her body. The funeral of Małgorzata Kwiatkowska took place a few days later and gathered many people who knew Małgosia or her family and people who found out about the brutal murder and wanted to pay tribute. After the funeral, Jadwiga and Krzysztof Kwiatkowski didn't close themselves at home to process grief in peace. They did the opposite thing. They started to visit Miłoszyce and knock on doors, like they did on the 1st of January, but this time they were asking questions about the night of the 31st of December, 1996. They were sure that someone must have seen or heard something, that such brutal violence couldn't have happened quietly. In the beginning, everyone understood the heartbroken parents. But the more questions and inquiries, the more the neighborhood of the Alcatraz disco was getting tired and then angry with this situation. Because how many times does one have to answer the same questions over and over again? At some point, people stopped opening the doors for Jadwiga and Krzysztof. However, at the same time, the police started their own investigation, and the officers weren't so easy to brush off. The case was handed over from the local police station in Jelcz to the office in Wrocław. Jadwiga and Krzysztof closely cooperated with the police, either by bringing them information they found important or asking constantly about the progress of the case. The progress was slow, almost non-existent. Somebody saw something, someone else heard something, but in most cases, these signals turned out to be gossip. Małgosia's parents started to feel that they were missing something, or that people living in Miłoszyce simply didn't want to talk. But why? Were they scared? Or were they covering the murderer because he was one of the locals? Both Małgosia's parents and the officers working on this case started to think that there was a conspiracy of silence in Miłoszyce. In the beginning, the prosecutor's office didn't want to say much about the murder and the theories on who might have done it. As it turned out, they didn't say much because they didn't know much. Local journalists and even priests were asked for help. Newspapers called potential witnesses from their front pages to come forward and talk with the police. In churches, people were encouraged to talk to help resolve the case. At the end of January, the prosecution urged anyone who had information and even the faintest hint about what happened on the night from the 31st of December and the 1st of January to anonymously call or write a letter to the police station. All the police and the prosecution had was a testimony of Krzysztof, who spent most of that evening with Małgosia, and Andrzej, his best friend. According to them, Małgosia walked away with her brother, Irek, and another boy joined them, which was confirmed by Andrzej's mother, Urszula. Besides the name of the fake brother, the only specific thing Andrzej and Krzysztof could say about this man was his hairstyle. It was referred to as a mushroom haircut. It was quite distinctive, but not particularly unique in the 90s. Nonetheless, the police compiled an identikit of Irek and this other man who, according to the witnesses, wore glasses. The portraits were published in newspapers, along with the drawings of Małgosia's missing shoes and jewelry. However, the articles on this case were initially written mostly by the local newspapers. Then, a few months later, when there was no progress on the case, the murder gathered some national attention. It was mostly thanks to a journalist from Radio Wrocław, who kept talking about this case from the beginning. She also wrote articles and prepared materials for national newspapers and TV. She saw how little the police were willing or able to do about this case. She also realized that Jadwiga and Krzysztof, Małgosia's parents, were treated poorly by the police who kept dismissing them. The journalist's name was Jolanta Krysowata, and I'm mentioning her because she'll play a role further in the story. She also helped Małgosia's parents get a pro bono attorney who tirelessly fought for justice in this case for over a decade. The important part of the story is that in the 90s, cases like this were happening every day, unfortunately, especially when it comes to crimes committed by young or very young people, children almost. or where teenagers were victims of such crimes. The problem of brutal violence was so serious that silent marches that would go through bigger towns and cities after particularly brutal attacks became a thing back in the 90s because people were shocked about this phenomenon and couldn't understand it. This is a topic that could probably be better explained by a sociologist or criminologist. The 90s were also a golden time for the Polish mafia, and no week could go by without national newspapers writing about new gunfights, bombs, and attacks. And in the middle of this, we have a freshly constructed Polish police force. And I'm saying freshly constructed because it was shortly after the political transformation from 1989, the transformation that ended communism and started democracy. The police in general wasn't a new force in Poland. It existed before until August of 1944, when the communist authorities dissolved the police and in October of the same year created the Citizens Militia. The new organization was under a very strong influence of the communist authorities throughout its entire existence. And to say it nicely, it wasn't loved or respected in Polish society, mostly due to its close cooperation with the security service, known for its political repressions and even tortures and executions performed against the members of the opposition. When the police was reinstated, it was chaos, because nobody knew who was who. The entire administration had to change. Those who cooperated with the security service had to be tracked down and removed from the organization, and this task wasn't easy. This chaos, combined with deep economic changes happening in the country at the time, and the fact that there was no money in the budget to properly support the police, resulted, as you can probably imagine, in the low effectiveness of the functioning of the police for the first few years. Maybe even more than just a few years, actually. It could have been a decade or more. Society's attitude towards the new police force wasn't overwhelmingly enthusiastic, to be honest. It still isn't, up to this day. However, the situation has gotten better over the years. But some people still remember the repressions, and even in cases like this one, when we're talking about the brutal murder of a teenage girl, it doesn't seem to be too shocking that people didn't want to talk, or that they didn't believe that the police is actually able to resolve this case. It seemed that the investigation got stuck at the point of interrogating witnesses. The main focus was on the R family, who owned the place where Małgosia was found. They claimed they didn't see or hear anything, that even their dog that was kept outside didn't bark that night, even though normally it was very aggressive and vocal against strangers. Of course, the closest neighbors were also interrogated. A woman living next door testified that she saw two boys pretty much dragging a girl that night, and they were headed to the yard where the girl was found later on. But the woman couldn't say much about the boys, it was dark. For this reason, she couldn't be 100% sure that these boys were the same ones who, a bit earlier, were clearly coming from the yard, but with bottles of alcohol. The other neighbor, living opposite of the R family's house, said that she saw a girl walking with two boys that night after midnight, and she remembered that because the girl had a black dress on, no jacket, and it showed she was cold. Then before 2 a.m., this woman heard the girl screaming. But she didn't do anything about this, probably because many drunken teenagers and young people were in the neighborhood that night, having fun and being noisy. So she didn't think much about the scream. Another person heard a girl scream, "Mom, Mom," that night, but just like in the previous case, they didn't do anything about this. And then we have the C family, who also lived next door to the R family, and you need to know that these two families are related, they're cousins. They also didn't see or hear anything, plus they pointed out that the yard of the R family was not visible from their house because of the trees, so in general, they couldn't help. There were 3 daughters in the R family, and the 2 of them spent New Year's Eve with their boyfriends. At the beginning of the night, all 4 of them, 2 girls and their boyfriends, went to the C family because it was one of the cousins' birthday. At about midnight, everybody went back to the R family's yard to welcome the new year with fireworks. After the fireworks, one of the girls and her partner decided not to go inside, but to go to the disco instead. And then they saw 2 strangers in the yard, right by the fence. As it turned out, the intruders used the spot to keep their bottles of alcohol there. they couldn't bring it to the disco, and they wanted to keep the bottles cold and hidden away from people who could potentially steal them. One of the R girls, when she saw that, got mad and kicked the strangers out of the yard. She couldn't understand how they could just waltz into someone else's private property and use it as a fridge and storage room because one of the strangers also left his bike in there. But she didn't know that these two weren't complete strangers. At least not to her boyfriend, Paweł. Because Paweł knew one of these guys. He met him at a liquor store earlier that evening and told him that there was going to be a disco in Miłoszyce. The stranger's name was Irek. He had a younger brother who happened to be friends with Paweł, which is how Paweł knew Irek and why he approached him in the store. Irek was happy to hear about the disco. He had a fight with his wife that day and was looking for a place to spend New Year's Eve away from home. Both Irek and Paweł left the store and went to Miłoszyce together, where Paweł offered that Irek could leave his bike and alcohol in the R family's yard because they should be safe there. Then they split. Irek went to the disco, where he was joined by his friend, nicknamed Gruby, which means the fat one. And Paweł went to a birthday party with his girlfriend and her family first. Then after midnight, they all went to the disco as well. For some reason, however, Paweł didn't tell all this to his girlfriend when she kicked Irek and Gruby out of her yard, that they were there because he let them. He told her later when they were coming back home at around 4 a.m. and Irek was following them. The girl got scared. It was still very dark, but Paweł calmed her down by saying that he knew Irek and that he let him leave his bike in the yard, so Irek was going with them to retrieve it. I'm pretty sure that all three gentlemen, Paweł, Irek, and Gruby, saw each other a few more times that night, and not only at the disco. Irek was seen shuttling back and forth between the disco and the R family's yard to get more alcohol. And Paweł also didn't stay by his girlfriend's side all night. He would leave the disco quite a few times, either to get more alcohol from his girlfriend's house or to go to the bathroom because he claimed he had a toothache and he tried to get rid of it by rinsing his mouth with something. Also, there's something about the R family I didn't say earlier. The family's grandma was known in the village for making her own alcohol, a moonshine. However, reportedly, she closed her business very early that New Year's Eve, and I was wondering if she ran out of her supply due to the high demand of that night, or if it was for some other reason. And I'm saying this because a few days after Małgosia was murdered, all of the buildings on the R family's property were entered and checked by the police, and in one of the outbuildings, some trucks of dark brownish substance were found on the furniture and floor, and some silver jewelry. The jewelry was shown and then handed over to the family. When Małgosia's parents found out about this, they wanted to see the jewelry to make sure it didn't belong to Małgosia, but then they heard that the family lost it. They didn't have it anymore. Also, I have no idea what happened with the traces found in this building because it didn't say anywhere in the sources that the substance was in any way tested, and what was it. The police were also told by the neighbors that the R family repainted the building a few days after New Year's. I'm guessing it must have been inside, given the severe weather conditions. The family denied, however, that any painting had been done. But then the prosecutor's office received an anonymous letter saying that the R family was not only known for making moonshine, which was also consumed at this place by, let's call them, customers, but also, reportedly, they were running some sort of a brothel. The person who wrote the letter and made all these accusations swore that there were often parties involving sex workers in the outbuilding where the traces were found, and that this place was thoroughly cleaned and tidied shortly after New Year's Eve. Again, the family denied all the allegations and reported that they started to get death calls after the murder. I didn't find information on whether this lead was investigated further by the police, so up to this day, we still don't know what the found substance was, or if the jewelry that got lost belonged to Małgosia. It seems, however, that none of the R family members was ever a suspect in this case. The police focused on interrogating all the young men who were at the disco that night, Not sure how they found them all, and if it's even possible. But they interrogated especially those men whose names were Irek or Mirek, as these two can get mixed up easily. And this is how we get to Irek, who left his bike and alcohol in the R family's yard. He was interrogated because Małgosia's parents saw him very early in the morning, somewhere near the Alcatraz disco, and he was riding a bike. I think this could have alarmed them somehow. Early winter morning, probably pitch dark, very frosty and snowy, and a guy is riding a bike, going God knows where. He was asked a few standard questions, like his age, he was about 22 at the time, where he was from, and why he went to the disco in Miłoszyce when he lived in Piekary, which is a few kilometers away. So Irek explained that he had a fight with his wife, and he didn't want to spend New Year's Eve with her in their apartment. Apparently, he fought with his wife because he got paid at work that day, and he immediately spent some sum of money on alcohol, and then went to his wife's work. She got really mad when she saw him drunk. They were a freshly married couple with 2 small children, and I'm guessing Irek's wife wasn't over the moon about the fact that her husband carelessly spent money on vodka instead of groceries. Apart from that, though, Irek was asked if he saw anything interesting or remembered something specific from that night, and he actually did. He said that at some point, it was a few hours into the party, he sat on the DJ stand, that little stage where the DJ was playing music, to get some rest from dancing, when he saw a heavily drunk couple lying on the stage next to him, and it seemed that they were very much enjoying themselves. The girl was on her back, with her tights slightly down and the dress up. He didn't see much in dark, but enough to notice that the girl had white socks with 2 red stripes. He tried to make his presence known to the couple, so he slapped the girl's knee, but neither she nor her companion reacted to that, so he just walked away and let them do whatever they were doing. It seems that nobody else noticed a couple having sex on the stage during a party, because from what I read, nobody else mentioned that during the investigation, and it seems a bit weird to me that this guy remembered something so specific, like the girl's socks, even though it was dark and he was drunk. When asked about Małgosia, Irek said he never saw her, he never met her, and that he found out about her death on the 2nd of January, 1997, from his colleague. Something must have caught the police's attention in his testimony, because the prosecutor wanted Irek's apartment searched, which happened shortly after the interrogation, but nothing interesting was found there, so Irek was ruled out as a suspect. The police were running out of ideas. It seemed that no person that they questioned had anything significantly relevant to say. They had to get back to the very beginning of the investigation to make sure they didn't miss anything. The last person, apart from 2 strangers walking with Małgosia to the R family's yard, who saw the girl, was Krzysztof. In the beginning, the boy would say that he met Małgosia at the disco. He liked her, but when she got heavily drunk, he started to be tired of her behavior, so when her brother approached them inside of the building, Krzysztof was relieved that Małgosia was no longer his problem. But then, something weird happened. During one of his interrogations, Krzysztof unexpectedly admitted that he and Małgosia had sex that night, and that it happened in the R family's yard. In the middle of the frosty night, 2 teenagers who pretty much didn't know each other, who had never been to the Alcatraz disco before, and didn't know the Miłoszyce village very well, went to a random yard to have sex. And it wasn't even the nearest yard to the disco building. Looking at a map, it seems to me that you have to know this place to get there, and to know you're not going to be seen by anyone. And of course, only the 2 of them went there, Małgosia and Krzysztof, even though 2 or 3 witnesses had already testified at that point that they indeed saw Małgosia that night, but with 2 boys, not 1. But Krzysztof was with his friend, Andrzej, that night, so maybe the 2 of them took Małgosia to the R family's yard and hurt her. But this seems unlikely, because neither Krzysztof nor Andrzej answered the description of these 2 guys who were seen with Małgosia after she left the disco. Also, both of them went to a bar called Panda at around 1 a.m. with a group of their friends. And at that point, Małgosia was already missing. Krzysztof was interrogated a few times, but there has never been an official report made after his interrogation. What's more, after he told the police that he had sex with Małgosia that night, Krzysztof changed his mind after a few hours of interrogation and got back to the very first version of his testimony. The last time he saw Małgosia was when she was taken away by her brother. And he has never, ever changed his deposition again. When his father picked him up from the custody, because Krzysztof got arrested for 24 hours, probably to make him think his entire testimony through, the first thing the father had to do was take his son to the hospital. Krzysztof was so beaten up that he could hardly stand straight. He was bruised and suffered a head injury. Later, he admitted that after many hours of interrogation and beating, he told the police that he had sex with Małgosia because they promised to let him go when he said what they wanted him to say. But since it wasn't true, he called everything off. He was scared he would go to prison for something he didn't do. However, there is an interesting part of the story. It wasn't only the police who were interested in what Krzysztof had to say, because the Radio Wrocław journalist that I mentioned earlier also wanted to know if Krzysztof knew anything more about what happened with Małgosia. And he told her something he never said to the police. That the night when Małgosia was murdered, he saw what happened because he was in the barn at the R family's yard with another girl. That would explain why the police psychologist found Krzysztof's explanations unconvincing. Probably that part about Krzysztof never seeing Małgosia again after she left with her brother. And also why the polygraph test that Krzysztof underwent in April of 1977 showed that the boy might have had something to do with the events from the night of the 31st of December 1996. However, the polygraph test results cannot be used in Polish court as proof. Also, Krzysztof called his second testimony off, the one when he said that he had sex with Małgosia. His DNA was never found on Małgosia's body or clothes, and he only told the journalist that he saw something from the barn. He never said it to the police. So the police had nothing on him. They had to let him go, and this lead was dropped, as well as his friends, Andrzej, who was also interrogated, but didn't have to go to the hospital afterwards. Andrzej spoke with a psychologist who assessed his testimony as credible, and he also underwent a polygraph test, which suggested that Andrzej might have had knowledge on what happened to Małgosia and who was responsible for it. In my opinion, this might indicate that what Krzysztof told the journalist might be true. He saw what happened, and maybe he told his best friend about it. But Krzysztof and Andrzej never came forward. They never told the police, which doesn't surprise me, given the fact that Krzysztof got severely beaten up at the police station and very likely manipulated into telling them an untruthful version of events so that the police could finally get at least one suspect. It was speculated, based on the coroner's report and the inspection of the crime scene, that there were more than one attacker, probably 2 or 3. And the police weren't able to find even one person who could be held responsible for Małgosia's death. Officially, everybody kept silent in Miłoszyce village, but behind closed doors, rumors were going around about who did this and why this person had still not been charged. The son of a local businessman, probably one of the richest people in the area. The businessman had 2 sons, actually, and it was never said which one was supposed to be involved in the murder. Both of them were young men in their 20s, and because no one had been arrested for a long time, people started to say that this was probably because of their father's money, that both of them were untouchable because of his social connections, that the father makes sure that his boys were safe from jail. Maybe he even bribed someone. That's why nobody wanted to say anything out loud. People were afraid for their safety and the safety of their daughters and wives. However, there was one person who came forward eventually, a woman who went to the police and told them a very weird story that, in my opinion, doesn't really make much sense, and which was supposed to prove that one of the businessman's sons was with Małgosia that night. Apparently, she saw them together, and also, unknowingly, she confirmed Krzysztof and Andrzej's version, that Małgosia was taken away from the disco by a blonde boy with a mushroom haircut. She wasn't at the disco, but stayed outside of the building for a while because she wanted to spot her son's new girlfriend. By the way, her son's name was also Irek. After her first deposition at the police, she claimed she was harassed and even kidnapped by strange men who wanted to keep her quiet, so she asked for police protection. However, as it later turned out, this woman was a former employee of the local businessman. She was a cleaner at his firm, but got fired. It seemed that nobody really believed her words. They could have been taken as revenge on her former boss, or an attempt to distract the police attention from her son. Everybody knew that the police was looking for Irek. Maybe she was scared that her son had something to do with Małgosia's death and wanted to protect him, just in case. Most importantly, though, both the businessman's sons were interrogated by the police and had alibi for the New Year's Eve night, and many witnesses confirmed their versions. That, of course, didn't convince good people of Miłoszyce, and the rumors increased. Both brothers noticed that everybody was talking about them. So they went to the police station and asked for DNA tests to prove once and for all that they had nothing to do with the murder. I don't know why, but only the younger brother's DNA was compared with the DNA found on the crime scene, and there was no match. Then the sleep was also dropped. So this is how it looked with the investigation from 1997. Every time it seemed that the police found something, they would start to check it and then would leave it halfway through. They interrogated all the boys from the disco. They found Irek, the DJ, then Irek with the bike. Then they thought it could have been Krzysztof, or Krzysztof and his best friend Andrzej. Then maybe the businessman's sons. But all leads were dropped at some point. Małgosia's parents were hopeless and powerless. All they could do was try and find something out by themselves. And they did, eventually, in April 1997. Mr. Kwiatkowski, Małgosia's dad, found out that his former colleague's and neighbor's son, Norbert, was working as a security guard in the Alcatraz disco the night Małgosia was killed. And because they were neighbors, Norbert knew Małgosia, or at least saw her many times, so he could potentially know something, especially because as a bouncer, his job was to stand right by the entrance, and Małgosia would leave the disco many times during the night because she didn't feel well, so they may have bumped into each other. But before Mr. Kwiatkowski even managed to speak with Norbert, Norbert found the Radio Wrocław journalist, the one who kept writing about the murder from the beginning and helped Małgosia's parents get a pro bono attorney. He made an appointment with her. And what an interesting conversation they had. So apparently, Norbert told the journalist that he was attacked in April 1997, 4 months after the murder. He was driving somewhere with his friend, and at some point of his journey, he spotted 2 of his acquaintances waiting at a bus station. So he pulled up and wanted to offer his acquaintances a lift, at which moment 2 stranger men, suddenly, out of nowhere, opened the doors of his car and attacked him. They tried to strangle him and threw him out of his own car. When Norbert's 2 acquaintances realized what was happening, they called the police. But I don't know how, because in 1997, hardly anyone had a cell phone. They were super rare and expensive. The police arrived and ran a make on the attackers, who apparently kindly stayed at the scene. They didn't go anywhere. And what's interesting, the 2 attackers turned out to be police officers. Of course, they were let go by the officers who came to the scene. Following that, Norbert went to the nearest police station to report the attack. He actually had to go there twice to tell the police what happened, and according to Norbert, he wasn't treated seriously. He told the officers, who questioned him about the incident, that in his opinion, the attackers could have had something to do with the murder of a girl in Miłoszyce during New Year's Eve of 1996. I don't know what this opinion was based on. However, in response, he was told by the police that this whole situation was a misunderstanding, and that those 2 men who got into his car were police officers from Wrocław who took over the case and simply tried to find out more about the night of the murder. Sometime later, it was revealed that these police officers from Wrocław had never been questioned about the situation, so we don't know what it looked like from their perspective. During the interrogation regarding the attack, Norbert was called to the fire station. He's a firefighter and apparently a bouncer during weekends, so he couldn't finish his testimony. However, later he found out that under the report from the interrogation, there was his statement that he drops all the allegations against the police officers from Wrocław and his signature. Norbert told the journalist that he didn't recall having made such a statement or signing anything. But that wasn't all. It wasn't the last meeting that Norbert had with the journalist from Radio Wrocław, because in July of 1997, they met again, along with Małgosia's parents. This time, the meeting was recorded. Norbert admitted that there were more attacks on him, and that he was getting threatening calls from anonymous people who would say that he talked with the police too much and that such a behavior would have its consequences, such as hurting him or his girlfriend. Norbert was scared for his life, but it seemed that the reason why he didn't go to the police with that was because, according to him, he was attacked by the police officers in April, so it didn't feel safe. And then he dropped a bomb. He listed the names of 3 people who were supposed to be responsible for killing Małgorzata Kwiatkowska. The businessman's son, I don't know which one, as you remember there were 2, a former police officer from Miłoszyce, and the third guy was one Paweł from Jelcz. Małgosia came from Jelcz as well. As you might remember, the boyfriend of one of the R family's daughters was named Paweł, the one with the toothache. But this might be just a coincidence. It's quite a popular name in Poland, so I can't 100% tell if it was the person that Norbert was talking about. Norbert said that he wanted this unofficial testimony recorded in case something happened to him, and he swore he would tell all this to the prosecutor as long as he got an anonymous witness status. For those who never heard about an anonymous witness, or as we call them in Poland, an incognito witness, this is a person who testifies in the trial, but their identity remains unknown to everyone except for the judge and the prosecution. That means that no one can see the witness, know their true voice. It might get purposefully distorted on the recording. They can't be asked questions that might in any way reveal their identity, even including gender. And the witness answering the questions needs to make sure they don't disclose any details about themselves too, which might get tricky, especially when you testify in a language like Polish, and, for example, in our language, verb endings differ for all genders. All this has to be kept top secret if there is a good reason to fear for the witness's life, health, or the well-being of their family. Getting back to Norbert, he said he would officially testify as long as he got an anonymous witness status, but he never went to the police to tell them about threats he was getting, about the attacks. He never told them about these 3 men that he thought hurt Małgosia. The police found out about this recorded conversation with the journalist. Also, Małgosia's parents and the journalist herself urged Norbert to testify. But when asked about the situation by the police, Norbert said that it was the journalist who gave him 2 names and asked if they could be responsible for Małgosia's death, to which Norbert, according to him, replied that they could have been at the disco, but he never said that they hurt Małgosia. So these are completely different versions, but bear in mind that 3 people say one thing, I mean Mr. and Mrs. Kwiatkowski plus the Radio Wrocław journalist, and they have the entire conversation recorded. By the way, I have no idea what happened with this recording and if it was ever used. I guess it hasn't, out of the journalist's duty to protect sources. And on the other side, we have Norbert, who apparently is scared for his life, but still asks for a few meetings with the radio journalist. My understanding is that he found her, not the other way around, tells her a story, agrees to have it recorded, and then doesn't want to talk about this at the police and denies that he ever gave any names, knowing well that this unofficial testimony was recorded. So what this was all about? Whose version is true and who lies? Because Norbert made it sound like the journalist made it all up. Why would she? She couldn't have gone to the police and testified for Norbert. What would she achieve by saying something that was not true? For now, Norbert is unfortunately another lead we have to drop. But maybe we'll be more lucky with other than personal evidence like DNA and all sorts of prints. As you may remember, DNA samples were collected from Małgosia's body and clothes lying under and around her. 2 things are particularly interesting here. First, the hat found on the crime scene. A black woolen hat that didn't belong to Małgosia. Hers was white. A few hairs were found inside the hat, and the investigators were hoping, besides getting the DNA samples, that they would be able to save the smell of the hat and present it to the tracking dogs to find out where the attackers went. But this turned out to be impossible. It was far too cold and frosty for the tracking dogs to find any lead on the day when Małgosia was found. I didn't even know that frost matters for the tracking dogs, but here we are. The hat was still preserved in a jar for scent purposes, and it will be used later in the story, as you will find out. The other piece of clothing that was particularly interesting for the investigators was, as you might probably guess, given the nature of this crime, the victim's underwear. And there was a surprise. No signs of sperm, only blood was found on Małgosia's underwear. My guess would be that the attackers could have used condoms. However, as it was the 90s and sex offenders, at least in Poland, a poor country which couldn't really afford complicated and expensive DNA tests at the time, didn't really care about leaving their sperm at the crime scene, or most of them didn't even realize that they could be traced using their sperm. So the experts from the medical university in Wrocław said, and this is absolutely terrifying, that the attacker was probably unable to, let's call it, perform the way they hoped, probably due to their previous alcohol consumption, and therefore they revenged themselves on the victim by pretty much destroying her intimate body parts in an incredibly brutal way and by beating and kicking her all over her body, as if it was her fault that they couldn't properly finish what they started. Apparently, this is very common for sex offenders, especially when it comes to sex crimes committed by men against women. It absolutely disgusts me. DNA in this case was mostly retrieved from hairs found at the crime scene, but we'll later find out that the sample collection was not complete back in the 90s. This will be made right many years later, but still far too late. There was no foreign DNA found in Małgosia's mouth and intimate body parts. All DNA samples collected from the crime scene were compared with the DNA of all men interrogated by the police at this point of the investigation, including Krzysztof, his friend Andrzej, Irek with the bike, one of the businessman's sons, and so on. There was no match. However, you need to know how the DNA samples were tested. It didn't look like in CSI Miami, where a technician puts, for example, a piece of clothing in a vial, adds some mysterious substances in it, then puts a vial in the machine, and then a few moments later, the machine sends data to the computer, which shows a complete DNA profile from that piece of clothing and automatically compares it with the suspect's DNA. No, it was 1997 in Poland. The test that was at the investigators' disposal was called polymarker. It only allowed to show 6 DNA markers that were later compared with the DNA profiles of the suspects without using a computer or any other machine, but by using the technician's eyesight. So to put it simply, the DNA expert had something that looked like a barcode, and they had to compare it with another barcode, if they matched. And like I said, only 6 markers could be compared. There was a better DNA test available at the time, an mtDNA test, which checks the DNA of the mitochondrion that each and every one of us inherits after one's mother, and it's much more specific than polymarker. But the mtDNA test was extremely expensive, so it wasn't used. As of 1997 in this case, the police had no DNA evidence that could help them resolve the case. Next up, prints. The first thing that would come to my mind would be fingerprints, but not in this case. At no point in researching the story did I find any mention of fingerprints, as if they didn't exist. Maybe they couldn't have been collected from Małgosia's body or clothes. Maybe the weather had something to do with it, I don't know. But there were other prints, like jaw prints, found on the victim's arms and breasts. Pictures of the said jaw prints were taken at the crime scene and in the morgue during the autopsy, so one could hope that something so specific as teeth arrangement would lead to at least one attacker. First of all, the pictures were taken from a wrong angle, and the forensic rulers were put too far from the prints. Also, somebody forgot that the surface of the human's breasts is not flat, but arched. So the model of the attacker's jaw was created using distorted scale and measurements. Still, it was compared with jaw prints collected from all the interrogated men, and again, no match. About that, it seemed that no prosecutor was a good match for this case too. There were 3 prosecutors during the first investigation. I'm saying the first because there will be more. In the beginning, everyone thought, this is also what the police would say, that finding the person responsible for Małgosia's death would just be a matter of time, a short time. Then the longer the investigation took, the more the prosecution and the police realized that they had nothing. The first prosecutor wasn't even a prosecutor as such at the time. She is now. The best way to describe it, without getting too deep into the Polish judicial system, was that she was a prosecutor's assistant, trained at the time to become a full-time prosecutor. And because of that, we can't say that it was in any way an experienced person. After 4 months, the case was taken over by another prosecutor, higher ranked, but the problem was that he was terminally ill and died after a few months. So then we have the third prosecutor, who had never investigated a murder before. These constant changes were obviously bad. Firstly, because nobody had proper control over the police's work. And as we saw, they did whatever they wanted, including hurting witnesses like Krzysztof, who after his interrogation was taken to hospital with brain edema. And also, one might think that a new prosecutor would bring something new to the case, a fresh angle on it, but an opposite happened. Every one of them picked up exactly where the previous one left off. No new leads, no new ideas. It seemed that no one really cared, especially because, as I mentioned earlier, cases like Małgosia's weren't particularly unusual in the 90s. In May of 1997, only 5 months after Małgosia's death, another person died at the disco. It wasn't Alcatraz, to be fair, because it was permanently closed at that time, but it was somewhere in the area. Also, 2 other girls were attacked within a few months in Jelcz, both in August of 1996, a few months before Małgosia. One of the girls was saved by some random people who saw what was happening, but the other girl wasn't so lucky. She was hurt twice the same night, by 2 different men, but survived, unlike Małgosia. The interesting part is that in both cases, the same DNA trace was found on the victims and tested using the polymarker method. What's more, a blonde guy with a mushroom haircut was seen around, along with a white Fiat 126P, which was also seen the night Małgosia was murdered. But it doesn't have to mean anything. Both the haircut and the model of the car were very, very popular at the time. Later, the police will eventually link these 3 cases, Małgosia and the 2 girls from August 1996, but the result will be miserable, to say the least. I'm sorry I'm being so vague now, but I try to keep everything in more or less chronological order, given that this case is already overly complicated. The local community of Jelcz was terrified about the situation in the region. These random attacks, deaths and rapes, especially when young people or, in some cases, children, were either victims or perpetrators of them. Admittedly, though, there were people who dared to blame the victim and her parents for what happened. Someone wrote a letter to a local newspaper stating that the girl's parents were responsible for Małgosia's death because they let her go to the party. To which the newspaper responded that, for Christ's sake, the only person responsible for the murder is the murderer, and that's all there is to it. Also, as the author of the response article pointed out, the family of the attacker must have seen signs of the attack on the killer's face when they came back home after the disco. Małgosia tried to defend herself and surely left scratches on the attacker's body, and no one ever came forward. The newspaper also wrote that it's pathetic what the prosecutor said lately, that she would love to carry out a polygraph test on a few suspects, but she can't do that because they didn't consent, or their parents didn't consent, if it regards underage boys. The article ended with a call for more police and prosecution involvement in resolving the case. On the 21st of February, 1997, students from Małgosia's high school organized a silent march against violence, following the example of their fellow students from different towns and cities, like Gdańsk, Krakow, or Warsaw, where marches like this took place after particularly brutal attacks on young people in the years of 1996 and 1997. These marches gathered thousands, sometimes even tens of thousands of people. The march in Jelcz gathered around 3,000 people. It was something that teenagers, along with their parents and teachers, felt they needed to do to show their anger, fear, and disapproval of the situation. They were holding placards saying, "We don't want to die young," or "Live and let live." Students were talking with the journalists who turned up at the event and said, "We knew Małgosia. What happened to her is mind-boggling. It could have been any of us." People were hoping that the march would change something, that the police would work harder on the case, that they would finally find a suspect. The parents and the students also pointed out that there is nothing interesting to do in town, no after-school activities, which makes teenagers bored and leads them to try to find some thrill in alcohol and drugs. After the march, an article was written by one of the local newspapers that announced that the police found the man who was most likely responsible for the first rape of the girl in the summer of 1996. It was the case when the victim was hurt twice the same night. The first perpetrator was arrested and the second not found. However, both DNA traces were collected, and it turned out that the second perpetrator had the same DNA profile as in Małgosia's case. Still, bear in mind that the DNA was tested using the polymarker method. Did the silent march, or the fact that the mayor of Jelcz increased the reward for information on who killed Małgorzata Kwiatkowska to 5,000 złotys, change anything? I'm afraid it didn't. Winter passed, spring passed. The police kept interrogating witnesses, checking leads, and then something happened. Something that very few people predicted, and something that, at first, couldn't have anything to do with the murder case. What happened was a flood. Today it is called the flood of the millennium. However, at the moment I'm writing these words, a terrible flood is happening in the exact same region, and I'm worrying that this one might be called the new flood of the millennium. But let's hope it won't be that bad. Anyway, the flood started in July of 1997, and as you might imagine, everybody's focus was on salvaging their houses and all kinds of belongings, rescuing others, and then, when the flood was over, it took people at least months, sometimes years, to recover after what happened. Many people died, not only in Poland, but also in Czech Republic, where the flood started, and in Germany. Material damages were estimated at $4.5 billion. It was an unimaginable tragedy, and therefore, no wonder that the entire Poland focused on the southwestern regions and the ways people could help those who lost everything in the disaster, including their loved ones. Jelcz, the town Małgosia came from, did suffer from the flood, but not as much as the neighboring towns and cities like Głuszak, Kłodzko, and especially Wrocław. However, many people from Jelcz volunteered to help with the flood, either by building embankments along with the firefighters, organizing food and clothes drives for the survivors, joining the rescue teams, and helping restore houses after the flood. Resolving a murder case, as gruesome as it was, simply was not a priority to the authorities, to journalists who used to write about Małgosia and the search for the killer, and to the residents of Jelcz, who wanted to focus on the task at hand, which was protecting theirs and other people's possessions and lives. On the 1st of January 1998, Małgosia's death day, there was only a brief mention of the case in the local newspaper. All this, the lack of new leads, the lack of ideas from the police and the prosecution on what to do next, then the flood, it must have inevitably ended in closing the case at the end of March 1999. It always blows my mind that cases like this can be closed. I mean, I do understand the concept. The resources of the police are limited. There are more cases like this happening, maybe not every day, but many times a year. Plus there are other crimes, not as spectacular, but still have to be dealt with. So at some point the investigation, where, as it seems, there is nothing more the police can do, has to stop. But it hurts me, and I'm sure that many police officers feel the same, that it means that the killer, an incredibly dangerous person, is still out there, still free, and potentially ready to attack again. And it means that they're not getting punished for what they did. Małgosia's parents felt absolutely hopeless, but they weren't alone. As I mentioned some time ago, the Radio Wrocław journalist who covered this case from the beginning helped Mr. and Mrs. Kwiatkowski get a pro bono attorney. The lawyer filed a complaint against the prosecutor's decision to close the case, which resulted in opening the investigation again, but with a deadline set to July 1999 first, and then extended till the end of the year. I'm not sure who the deadline was for at that point, as it seemed that the police and the prosecutor weren't too willing to do anything about the case, and it really does look as if the clock was ticking for Małgosia's parents and their lawyer, as if they were supposed to find new witnesses and new leads. The prosecutor had not changed. I mean, he was the third one appointed to the case, the one who never dealt with the murder case before. When he didn't manage to find out who hurt Małgosia Kwiatkowska, he just closed the case, but then he was given it once again, and it didn't look as if he tried harder to find the murderer. He interrogated some witnesses again and asked for more DNA tests, which looked like he was doing something, but turned out to be futile. However, when asked by the Kwiatkowski's family's lawyer to try to look for Małgosia's lost jewelry, the one that was found on our family's yard and then magically disappeared, he refused, as well as he refused to create a psychological profile of the killer, for he was told by one specialist, no idea who that was, that this couldn't be done in this case. That's all. It can't be done. The prosecutor didn't ask any other specialist if it was true. What's more, his entire attitude during this investigation could be summed up in these exact words: "This can't be done." Plus, any motions, queries, or asks from the family or their lawyer were treated as a personal attack on the prosecutor and an attempt to take control of the investigation. Eventually, the family's attorney filed a motion to dismiss the current prosecutor and appoint a new one. The motion was denied because the prosecution, or actually the higher-ranked prosecutor who processed the motion, stated that the investigation was carried out flawlessly and the family was informed of the progress every step of the way. When I was reading about this point of the story, I was beyond angry and frustrated. I wanted to scream. And I'm a complete stranger to Małgosia's family, researching this case almost 30 years after it happened, and yet it infuriated me. In this case, what Małgosia's parents must have felt when this was actually happening to them. In November 1999, Mr. Kwiatkowski wrote a letter to the President of Republic of Poland, Aleksander Kwaśniewski. There was a part of this letter that I read about 8 times, and I think it perfectly summarizes this entire case. I quote, in my probably flawed translation: "There's no such power that could change anything in this case, especially those people's attitude which is like, we will do what we want and there's nothing you can do about this. I come to the conclusion that there is no power for me, an ordinary man, to live to see the day when the crime that happened to my daughter, Małgosia, is solved." I believe this letter didn't change anything. I'm not even sure if Mr. President ever read it. In the meantime, the family's lawyer kept filing more and more motions for DNA tests, and one day, when she and Małgosia's dad went to the prosecutor's office to talk about the progress on the case, the prosecutor threw Małgosia's wrapped dress on the table, the one she wore on the night she died, and said to the family that they could have it back because no traces were found on it. Małgosia's father immediately yelled at the prosecutor to take the dress back and keep it for later. Maybe one day it will help find the murderer. So the prosecutor took it back. And thank God he did, because the dress will, in fact, help resolve the case many, many years later. I know you're all waiting for a breakthrough. We're already in 1999, over 2 years after Małgosia was murdered, and nothing's happening. To be honest, I want you to feel frustrated and impatient. I want you to try and imagine what heartbroken parents felt when they were waiting for updates, when they kept asking people questions and getting no satisfactory answers. It lasted for years. Years of pain, hopelessness, and loneliness, and probably anger. On the 6th of November, 1999, Major Edward D., a member of the Criminal Investigation Department in the Provincial Police Office in Wrocław, made a memo summarizing a piece of information that he received during his operational work. According to this information, the person responsible for killing Małgorzata Kwiatkowska on the night of the 31st of December 1996 and the 1st of January 1997 was Tomasz Komenda, a supposed ex-boyfriend of the victim and a sadist. To be continued.